Mike Anderson pulled his parka tighter around his body as the wind howled like a dying beast through the dense pines surrounding his remote Alaskan cabin. The temperature had plummeted to a merciless -40 degrees Fahrenheit, and the worst was yet to come. His battered radio crackled to life, the monotone voice of the emergency broadcast barely audible over the wind's fury. Blizzard warning, winds reaching 80 miles per hour, extreme frostbite risk. All travel is highly discouraged. Mike had survived countless winters in this unforgiving wilderness, but something about this storm unsettled him. Maybe it was the way the sky had darkened too quickly, the heavy storm clouds rolling in like an unstoppable tide, swallowing the last traces of daylight. Or perhaps it was the eerie silence before the first gusts hit, as if the land itself was holding its breath, waiting for something monstrous to descend upon it. Stepping onto his porch, he took a deep breath, his lungs burning as ice-cold air seared his throat. His cabin was built for survival. Thick log walls, reinforced shutters, a backup generator, and enough firewood to last through the worst of winters. But nature didn't play by rules, and Mike had learned long ago that arrogance got men killed out here. A distant sound broke through the wind, a low, guttural growl. Mike's gloved hand tightened around the rifle slung over his shoulder. Bears should have been deep in hibernation by now. Yet, as he scanned the tree line, he swore he saw movement, a dark shape shifting between the trees, too large to be a wolf, too silent to be the wind. Something was out there, and with the storm closing in, Mike knew one thing for sure. This night was about to become a fight for survival. The wind screamed through the trees, rattling the walls of Mike's cabin as if trying to tear it from its foundation. Snow swirled in blinding sheets, a whiteout consuming the world beyond his porch. He clenched his rifle, heart pounding, eyes locked on the tree line where he had seen the shadow move. For a moment, the world was nothing but howling wind and darkness. Then, another growl, closer this time. Mike took a slow step back toward his cabin door, his boots crunching in the snow. His mind raced. No bear should be active in these temperatures. Wolves? Possible, but they usually avoided humans unless desperate. Whatever it was moving against the wind, pushing forward when any normal animal would take cover. Then came the unmistakable sound of branches snapping. Something was coming. A shape emerged from the storm, looming in the blizzard like a nightmare-given form. At first, Mike thought it was a bear, but the proportions were off. Too tall, too broad, eyes glinting like ice under moonlight. His instincts screamed at him to run, but he held his ground, lifting his rifle. Then the figure staggered, collapsing into the snow. Mike hesitated, his finger hovering over the trigger. Not an animal. A person. Help! The voice was weak, barely audible over the wind. Mike lowered his rifle and rushed forward, kneeling beside the collapsed figure. It was a man, face half covered in frost, his coat torn, body shivering violently. Mike gritted his teeth. If he left him out here, he'd be dead in minutes. With a grunt, he hauled the man up, dragging him toward the cabin. The storm fought him, the wind pushing against every step, but he refused to let it win. Kicking open the door, he pulled the half-frozen stranger inside, slamming it shut against the fury outside. The man collapsed onto the wooden floor, gasping. Mike grabbed a blanket and threw it over him before crouching down. "Who the hell are you?" The stranger's breath came in ragged gasps. His lips were blue, his skin dangerously pale, but his eyes, there was something in his eyes that made Mike uneasy. A mix of fear and desperation. "They're coming," he whispered. Mike's stomach tightened. "Who?" The man swallowed hard, his voice barely a breath. "The ones who left me to die." Outside, the storm raged, but now Mike knew the real danger wasn't the cold. It was coming for both of them. Mike stared at the half-frozen man on his floor, his breath misting in the cold air of the cabin. The fire crackled in the stone hearth, sending flickering shadows across the walls, but the warmth barely seemed to touch the stranger. He was trembling, his face pale and frostbitten, but his eyes, those eyes, were filled with terror. The ones who left me to die. Mike's grip tightened on his rifle. Outside, the storm howled, rattling the windows like skeletal fingers clawing at the glass. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with something Mike couldn't quite place. Fear, warning, or something worse. "Who are you running from?" Mike asked, voice low. The man coughed violently before speaking. "They called me dead weight, left me out there to freeze." His eyes flicked toward the door as if expecting it to burst open at any second. "They won't let me walk away." Mike didn't like the sound of that. He'd come out here to escape people, not get tangled in someone else's problems. But leaving a man to die in a storm? That kind of cruelty didn't sit right with him. A sudden thud against the cabin wall made them both freeze. Mike shot to his feet, rifle raised, every nerve in his body on edge. Another thud, then a faint scraping, like something, or someone, dragging against the logs. The stranger sucked in a sharp breath. "It's them." Mike moved to the window, his breath fogging the glass. At first, he saw only white, blizzard-thick snow, swirling shadows, shifting darkness. Then movement. A figure, then another. Too many. His stomach twisted. They weren't just random travelers seeking shelter. A fist pounded against the door. Mike aimed the rifle at the entrance. "Who's there?" A pause, then a voice. Calm, almost friendly. Too friendly. "Sorry to bother you, friend. Just a few of us caught in the storm." Mike didn't buy it. He glanced at the man on the floor, who was shaking his head wildly, eyes wide with silent warning. Another voice, lower, sharper. "We know you're in there, Ian." Ian. So that was his name. Mike turned back to the door, his pulse hammering in his throat. He had two choices: open it and let them in, or keep it shut and prepare for a fight. But one thing was clear. This night was far from over. Mike's knuckles tightened around the rifle stock. The cabin walls felt thinner than ever, the wind outside howling like a wounded beast. Whoever was out there wasn't just seeking shelter, they were hunting. "Open the door, Mike," the voice outside called again, more insistent this time. Mike's heart skipped a beat. They knew his name. He whipped his head toward Ian, who was still slumped against the wall, his face pale as a ghost. Ian gave a barely perceptible shake of his head. "They don't just want me," Ian murmured. "They want you now, too." Mike's gut clenched. He was a loner by nature, had been for years, but something about the certainty in Ian's voice made his blood run cold. These weren't just desperate men. They were killers. A sudden crash shattered the tense silence. The window on the far side of the cabin exploded inward, shards of glass spraying across the wooden floor. Mike swung his rifle toward the gaping hole as a shadowy figure reached inside, clawing at the ledge. Boom! Mike fired. The shotgun blast sent the figure sprawling back into the snow with a guttural scream. "Shit! He's armed!" Someone outside snarled. The door rattled violently as they tried to force their way in. Mike rushed to reinforce it, sliding the heavy wooden beam into place. His heart pounded so hard he thought it might shake the walls. "They're not stopping," Ian gasped, trying to push himself up. His hands shook violently, whether from the cold or the fear, Mike couldn't tell. "They won't leave unless we make them." Mike glanced around the cabin. Limited ammo. No backup. Nowhere to run. The storm outside was still raging, making escape almost impossible. If they stayed holed up, they might last a few more hours. But eventually, those men would break in. And when they did... "Ian," Mike said, keeping his voice low, "you know these guys. What do they want?" Ian hesitated, then let out a shaky breath. "I stole from them. Food. Supplies. They were planning to do something bad, Mike. Real bad. I took what I could and ran." Mike stared at him, his jaw clenched. He had a choice. Toss Ian out and hope they leave, or stand his ground. But something in Ian's eyes told him the truth. They wouldn't leave a witness. Another window shattered. More voices, closer now. Time was up. Mike gritted his teeth. If they wanted a fight, he'd give them one. The wind outside roared like a living thing, a force of nature determined to bury them under ice and snow. The men outside weren't retreating. If anything, they were getting bolder. The cabin shuddered under the relentless assault. Boots against wood, fists pounding, the scrape of something sharp against the walls. Mike had been in tight situations before, but this was something else. Ian was barely holding himself up. He looked like hell, his lips cracked from the cold. One hand pressed against his wounded side. The color was draining from his face. He wouldn't last much longer like this. Mike had a choice. A terrible, impossible choice. "Mike," Ian rasped, "you gotta listen to me. You can still get out of this." Mike's grip on the shotgun tightened. "You think I'm just gonna hand you over?" "They won't stop," Ian said, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Not for me. Not for you. But if you do something unexpected." He sucked in a breath, pain twisting his features. "You might survive." Mike cursed under his breath. His brain was racing. The numbers weren't in their favor. 3, maybe 4 men outside. 2 bullets left in the shotgun. A pistol with half a magazine. No way to call for help. Then he spotted it. The old kerosene lamp sitting on the wooden shelf by the stove. His mind clicked into overdrive. There was another way out of this. Mike crouched beside Ian, his voice low and urgent. "Listen, they want you, but they also want this cabin. They need shelter as bad as we do. If I give them the illusion they've won, we might be able to turn the tables." Ian's brow furrowed, but then his gaze flickered to the lamp. Understanding dawned in his exhausted eyes. "They won't stop until they think we're dead," Mike continued, "so we make them think that." A moment passed between them, heavy with unspoken words. Mike didn't know Ian well. Hell, he'd barely trusted the guy a few hours ago. But something had changed. Now, their survival depended on each other. Ian swallowed hard, then nodded. "Do it." Mike grabbed the kerosene lamp and held it tight. Outside, the voices grew angrier. "We know you're out of ammo, Mike. You've got one chance. Hand him over or we burn you out." Mike's pulse pounded. He took a breath, then shouted back, "You want him? Come get him!" And then he threw the lamp. The glass shattered and the fire leapt to life, hungry and violent. The cabin erupted in flames. The fire spread fast, too fast. Flames licked up the wooden walls, devouring old beams, turning the cabin into a furnace. Smoke billowed thick and black, rolling toward the ceiling like a living thing, wrapping around Mike and Ian. This was their gamble, but had they just sealed their own fate? Outside, the men shouted in alarm. "Damn it! The whole place is going up!" Mike didn't hesitate. He grabbed Ian under the arm and hauled him toward the window. "We need to move, now!" Ian coughed violently, barely able to stand. He looked worse by the second, but there was no time to slow down. The fire was already closing in. Mike kicked open the back window. Freezing air rushed in, colliding with the heat, sending a cloud of sparks into the night. He gritted his teeth. This was it. "Hold on," he said, and together they tumbled out into the snow. The cold hit like a sledgehammer, sucking the air from his lungs. But there was no stopping, no second chances. He dragged Ian up and pushed forward into the blizzard, into the unknown. Behind them, the cabin burned bright against the night, flames reflecting off the snow. The men wouldn't give up, not yet, but they'd be too distracted trying to save whatever they could. That bought Mike and Ian a few precious minutes. They stumbled through the knee-deep snow, bodies numb, breath coming in short gasps. They should have been dead already. Mike's mind raced. There was an old hunting shack further up the ridge, a place he and his brother had used years ago. If they could make it there, they might have a chance. But Ian collapsed. "No, no, no," Mike muttered, dropping to his knees beside him. Ian's breathing was shallow, his face too pale. Mike checked his wound. It was bad. Too much blood lost. Ian needed medical help. Real help. And soon. Mike had spent his whole life following the rules. Out here, in the wilderness, there were unspoken laws about survival, about when to fight and when to run. But those rules weren't enough anymore. If he wanted to live, if he wanted Ian to live, he had to break them. That meant doing something reckless, something that could get them both killed. He took a deep breath and made his choice. Instead of running further into the wild, he turned back, toward the fire. Mike's body screamed in protest as he trudged back toward the fire. Every survival instinct told him to keep running, to disappear into the blizzard, but he shoved those thoughts aside. Ian wouldn't last another hour in the cold. If Mike had any chance of saving him, it lay in the burning cabin, and with the people trying to kill them. As the flames roared against the wind, Mike crouched low, using the snow as cover. The gang was in chaos, shouting as they tried to salvage supplies and weapons. Their leader, a tall, thickly bearded man in a fur-lined coat, barked orders, his silhouette stark against the inferno. Mike recognized him instantly. Ray Lancaster. Mike's pulse pounded. Ray was a legend out here, a ruthless tracker and mercenary. If anyone could survive in this wasteland, it was him. And if Ray was here, that meant Mike and Ian had just become targets in a much bigger game. Mike's eyes flicked toward the abandoned snowmobiles. That was his ticket out. If he could steal one, he might just have a chance of getting Ian to safety. But then, through the swirling snow, he saw her. A woman huddled against a nearby sled, her hands bound, her face bruised and smeared with soot. A mother. She clutched something, a small shivering bundle, a child. Mike's stomach twisted. He had heard the gang talking earlier, about prisoners, about selling someone. This woman wasn't with them. She was a victim. The firelight flickered across her face and Mike saw it. Determination, stronger than the storm itself. She wasn't waiting to be saved. She was waiting for her moment. Then their eyes met. She didn't scream. She didn't react. She just nodded. A silent plea. A mother's last effort. Mike cursed under his breath. He couldn't just leave them. A gunshot cracked through the air. Someone had spotted him. "Hey!" No time. No more choices. Mike lunged forward, ripping a knife from his belt as he charged toward the nearest man. Before the thug could react, Mike drove the blade into his shoulder, twisted, and yanked him down into the snow. The woman saw her opening. She spun, slamming her bound hands into another man's face, knocking him off balance. The child whimpered and she pulled him close, shielding him from the chaos. Mike grabbed the downed thug's pistol, turned, and fired. The shot echoed through the night and suddenly everything was moving at once. The gang rushed toward him. The woman grabbed her child and ran. And Mike, he ran too, straight for the snowmobiles. Mike's lungs burned as the roar of the snowmobile's engine cut through the storm's fury. The wind slapped his face, stinging his skin. But he didn't feel it. He couldn't. Ian was still out there, and every second wasted could be his last. As the lights of the cabin and the gang slowly faded in the distance, Mike's focus honed in on one thing: survival. He gripped the handlebars, leaning low to keep the snow from blinding him, his breath heavy in the thick, freezing air. He didn't know if he could make it back to Ian, not in this weather, but he had to try. The storm had swallowed the world whole. The snow fell in heavy, relentless sheets, and the night was so dark it felt like being swallowed by the void itself. Mike had always prided himself on his ability to track, to survive in the harshest environments. But this was different. The storm was a living thing, it seemed, its cold breath stealing away his sense of direction, its winds whispering threats into his ears. As he pushed the snowmobile harder, his mind kept flashing back to the woman and her child. Had they made it out? Had he done enough for them? His heart pounded with the guilt of leaving them behind, but Ian's condition weighed on him even heavier. They had no time to waste. Mike reached a clearing, and there, through the blinding white haze, he saw a familiar figure. Ian. The young man was half buried in snow, his body crumpled and twisted in a way that made Mike's stomach churn. His face was pale, his eyes barely open, flickering with the faintest trace of recognition when Mike called his name. "Ian! Hey, stay with me!" Mike leapt off the snowmobile, rushing to his side. Ian's body shuddered under the weight of the cold, and his lips were blue, his breathing shallow. Mike's mind raced. What had happened? Ian had been strong, alert, but now, this storm had drained him. He was dying. Mike yanked off his jacket, wrapping it tightly around Ian's torso. He worked quickly, trying to restore some warmth to his friend's freezing limbs. The storm's howl was deafening now, a constant roar as if the world itself was fighting against him. Mike's hands shook, whether from the cold or the fear, he couldn't tell. His fingers were numb, but he forced himself to stay calm. "Come on, Ian, you gotta fight. I'm not leaving you here." But Ian barely responded. His head lolled weakly to the side, his body trembling as if the storm itself had taken root in his bones. Mike could feel the panic rising. Number? Not like this. Not after everything. Ian wasn't going to die here. With a surge of adrenaline, Mike pulled Ian onto his back, trying to shield him from the wind. He staggered toward the snowmobile, desperate for shelter, knowing that the worst part of the storm was still coming. Ian's weight was heavy, and the wind made every step feel like a battle. Mike couldn't afford to fall now. Not with everything on the line. The snowmobile roared to life again, and Mike clutched Ian's limp body with everything he had, kicking the engine into full throttle. The storm seemed to fight back, howling and shrieking like an animal in pain. But Mike pressed on. He could see the faint flicker of light from the distant campfire, a beacon in the storm, just a little farther. Finally, the tree line broke and they were back near the abandoned cabin. But Mike didn't stop. He couldn't. He took a sharp turn, heading for a cave he had marked earlier, one that might provide shelter. The cave was small, but dry. The moment they entered, Mike's breath came out in ragged gasps. His hands were frozen, his legs numb, but there was no time to stop. He had to get Ian warm. He had to get him to survive. He started a small fire in the center of the cave, gathering what little dry wood he could find. His hands fumbled as he worked, clumsily throwing logs into the flames, his focus split between the fire and Ian. His friend was still unconscious, his skin dangerously cold to the touch. Mike couldn't afford to lose him. Minutes passed, then hours, and still the storm raged on outside. But inside the cave, slowly, carefully, the heat of the fire began to push back the chill. Mike sat with Ian's head in his lap, gently rubbing his arms, trying to restore circulation. His thoughts were a whirlwind, but there was one thought that kept pushing through the chaos. They had made it. Against the odds, against the storm, against everything that had tried to tear them apart, they had survived. Ian's breath started to steady. His face flushed with a little more color, though it was faint. He groaned softly, his fingers twitching, and Mike felt a small surge of hope flood his chest. "Come on, Ian. Don't do this to me now," Mike whispered, tears pricking at the edges of his eyes. The storm still howled, still tried to tear them apart, but for the first time that night, Mike felt a flicker of victory. They were alive. That was the first step. The next one would be getting out of here. But for now, they could rest. And with Ian's breathing growing steadier, Mike allowed himself a moment to close his eyes, knowing they were not alone in the storm. The storm was still swirling around them, but Mike and Ian had survived the worst of it. The cave had provided a fragile shelter, a brief pause in their relentless fight against the wilderness. Ian was no longer unconscious, but his body still trembled as it tried to recover from the shock of the cold. The fire had brought him back from the edge, but the wilderness was still a dangerous and unforgiving place. Mike knew that their respite was temporary, They couldn't stay in the cave forever. The storm was already beginning to lose its intensity, but that didn't mean they were out of danger. The wilds were vast, and in its grip there was no such thing as safety for long. Every decision now would carry the weight of life and death. "How are you feeling?" Mike asked, trying to hide the edge of his concern. Ian shifted slightly, his face still pale but his eyes clearer now. "Better," Ian muttered, his voice hoarse, "but I don't think I can go much further." His words hung in the air, the weight of them both undeniable. He had survived the storm's wrath, but the wilderness wasn't just about surviving the elements. It was a beast in its own right, one that took more than just the strength of body to conquer. Mike didn't answer immediately. He stood up and walked to the mouth of the cave, squinting into the dimming daylight. The storm was lifting, but it had left the world blanketed in deep snow, the trees bent under its weight. The air had a biting sharpness to it, but there was something oddly silent about the aftermath. The wind had quieted, the relentless flurry now reduced to gentle flakes falling from the heavy sky. He turned back to Ian, considering his words carefully. "We can't stay here," he said finally. "We need to move. There's a ridge about a day's journey out. If we can make it there, we might be able to find shelter or a way out of this." Ian winced, the prospect of moving feeling like a mountain he wasn't sure he could climb. "Mike, I can barely feel my legs. How do you expect me to move in this?" Mike's heart clenched, but his resolve didn't waver. "We do it together. I'll carry you if I have to, but we're not giving up now." The words were a challenge. They were a call to push through the pain, to fight against every instinct that screamed for safety, warmth, and rest. They were a reminder that survival didn't always come easy. It came with sacrifice, with grit, and sometimes with unbearable decisions. The air was colder now, biting at their exposed skin as they stepped out of the cave. The world around them was a stark white wasteland, the trees looming like silent sentinels, their branches heavy with snow. They had no supplies, no shelter beyond the remnants of what they could find in the wild. But they had something more. Mike tightened the straps of his pack and turned to Ian. His friend was barely able to stand, but the spark in his eyes was returning, a glimmer of that unrelenting will to survive. "I won't slow you down," Ian said, though his voice wavered. He was trying to push past his limits to prove that he could still fight. Mike could see the effort, and it made his heart ache. "You won't slow me down," Mike reassured him. "We're in this together, all the way." They started moving. The journey was grueling. Every step felt like it took hours, the snow too deep, the wind still too harsh. Ian leaned heavily on Mike, his body weak, but he refused to give in. He was fighting for his life, and Mike was fighting for his friend. They didn't have the luxury of rest, not yet. They had to keep moving, even as the world seemed to be against them. As the day wore on, the mountain ridge grew closer, but their energy was draining. Ian stumbled, his legs barely holding him upright. The pain in his face was evident now, but he kept going, never uttering a word of complaint. Mike felt the weight of the situation heavy on his chest. He could see it in Ian's eyes. He was pushing himself past his limits, but how much more could he take? Night was falling, and with it came a greater danger. In the wild, darkness was a different kind of threat. The cold seemed to bite deeper, the shadows longer, and the uncertainty of what lay ahead more terrifying. Mike had hoped they could make it to the ridge by sunset, but that hope was fading with every step they took. They needed a break. "Let's find some cover," Mike suggested, scanning the area around them. A small cluster of trees sat a few yards away, their trunks still weighed down by the snow. The shelter it offered was minimal, but it would have to do. Mike helped Ian to the base of one of the trees, leaning him against it before setting off to gather what little wood they could find. The storm was gone, but the wild was still a dangerous, unforgiving place. He had to keep Ian alive, no matter what. They huddled together. The warmth of the small fire they managed to start their only comfort as the temperature dropped once again. The sound of the crackling flames filled the silence between them. But even that wasn't enough to block out the nagging thought that hovered in Mike's mind. How much longer could they keep this up? Tomorrow would be the real test. They would have to make it to the ridge, no matter the cost. They had no choice, and with that, Mike closed his eyes, listening to the wild all around them, knowing that as long as they had each other, they would find a way. Frozen Bonds, Chapter 10. A final look and a lasting memory. The fire had burned down to embers, leaving only a dim glow that flickered against the dark sky. The air was biting cold, but the exhaustion in Mike's bones was far worse. The journey had been grueling, and the landscape ahead remained as treacherous as ever, an endless stretch of white. Mike looked over at Ian, his eyes heavy with the weight of the last several days. They had come so far, but the end was still not in sight. Ian sat near the base of the tree, his face pale, his body weary. The firelight made the lines of his face more pronounced, highlighting the toll the wilderness had taken on him. His chest rose and fell with labored breaths, but his spirit hadn't wavered. He was a fighter, and even though his body was exhausted, his mind still clung to the hope of survival. But Mike could see it now, the unmistakable signs of how close they were to the edge. The reality was inescapable. The wilderness had taken everything it could from them, and there was little left to give. Mike. Ian's voice broke the silence, weak but insistent. Mike turned toward him, the sound of Ian's voice pulling him out of his thoughts. Ian wasn't looking at him, but rather at the darkening sky, the stars beginning to twinkle in the black void above. "I don't know if I can keep going," Ian said quietly. The words weighted with a finality that Mike knew meant something was breaking inside his friend. Mike swallowed hard, trying to keep his emotions in check. He had known this moment was coming, but knowing it didn't make it any easier. Ian had fought for so long, against the storm, against the cold, against every obstacle the wilderness had thrown at them. And now it seemed that the wilderness had won. Ian's survival had become a battle of will, and Mike was at a loss. What could he say to make Ian believe they could make it through? The ridge was close, but they were so far from being able to reach it. "Ian." Mike's voice cracked slightly, the sound foreign and weak to his own ears. "We've been through worse than this, remember? We're not giving up now." Ian turned his gaze toward Mike then, and for a moment Mike could see the flicker of hope in his eyes, just a glimmer. It wasn't much, but it was enough. It was everything. But Ian's face fell again, the weight of the decision settling deep into his features. "I'm sorry," Ian whispered, his voice barely audible in the cold night. "I don't think I can make it." Mike felt his throat tighten, his heart sinking with the words. He opened his mouth to say something, to argue, to fight, but the words wouldn't come. How could he argue when Ian was right? The wilderness had worn them both down to the bone, and while Mike couldn't give up on his friend, the truth was that survival in this place required more than just willpower. It required resources, energy, and luck, and the wild, in its cold, unrelenting grip, didn't deal in luck. There was a moment of quiet, an almost sacred stillness between them. Ian had made his peace, and Mike could see that now. There was no fear left in his eyes, just acceptance. The storm had taken much from them, but it hadn't stolen that final spark of dignity. "I'm proud of you," Mike said, his voice rough, raw with emotion he couldn't hide any longer. "You fought harder than anyone I know." Ian smiled faintly, his eyes glimmering with something between relief and sorrow. "We both fought, but, Mike..." He paused, taking a deep breath. "If you make it out of here, don't forget me." Mike's heart clenched. "I will never forget you, Ian. Not ever." They sat in silence for what felt like an eternity. The fire flickered out slowly, the cold creeping closer to them. The stars above seemed impossibly far away, distant and cold, much like the world around them. But in that brief moment, in the fading light, the wilderness didn't seem so vast. It was just the two of them. Two men who had come together to survive, to fight side by side, and to face the unrelenting elements. No matter the outcome, they had shared this journey, and that would never change. Finally, Ian closed his eyes, his head sinking against the snowbank beneath him. His breathing slowed, and for a long moment, Mike didn't know whether it was the exhaustion or something deeper. The night had claimed so much already, but Mike held on to the memory of the man he had fought with, the man who had given everything for survival. He reached out and placed a hand on Ian's shoulder as though to anchor him to this world for just a moment longer. Mike knew what he had to do. The ridge was within reach, but he was too far from help. Alone, he would have to face the wilderness one last time, pushing through the bitter cold to find safety. It would be the hardest thing he had ever done. But as he rose from the snow, looking down one last time at the face of his fallen friend, he felt a fire inside him, an unshakable, determined heat. Mike stood for a long moment, taking in the vast expanse of the wild, the stark white horizon, the snow-covered trees. There was no turning back now. The journey had already taken so much from him, but it had also given him something precious, a lasting memory of a bond forged in fire and ice, one that would never fade. With a final, lingering glance, Mike turned and walked into the night, the cold biting at his skin, the weight of his decision heavy on his shoulders. The wilderness was vast, but so was his will to survive. And with every step, he carried with him the memory of Ian, the man who had taught him that survival wasn't just about fighting the storm. It was about surviving with honor, with heart, and with the unbreakable strength of friendship. And no storm could ever take that away.